In the quiet suburb of Maplewood Heights, December had always carried with it a special magic. Neighbors lined their rooftops with twinkling strands of lights, inflatable snowmen guarded front lawns, and glowing reindeer stood proudly on porches. The annual decorating tradition was something that gave the neighborhood its soul. Families gathered to sip hot cocoa and stroll down the streets to admire the dazzling displays. It was one of those rare moments when people actually felt like a community. But this year, that magic was threatened. The newly elected HOA President, a woman named Marjorie Whitfield, had other plans. Marjorie was known for her stern demeanor, an obsession with control, and a personality that seemed allergic to joy. Where others saw twinkling lights, she saw chaos. Where others saw a neighborhood tradition, she saw non-uniformity and aesthetic disruption. When the December newsletter arrived in mailboxes, residents read in shock as Marjorie unveiled her latest decree. All holiday decorations, including Christmas lights, were strictly prohibited. Her explanation was thin and cloaked in formality. She claimed the lights were a fire hazard, that they consumed too much electricity, and that they created unnecessary competition among neighbors. But beneath the polished excuses, everyone knew the truth: she simply hated them. At first, there was disbelief. Parents stared at the newsletter in silence, unable to explain to their children why the tradition they loved was suddenly gone. Neighbors whispered in driveways, exchanging stories of how their kids had already been sketching out light designs, only to have their dreams dashed by a single woman's ruling. The anger spread quickly. One resident, an older man named Gerald, had been putting up Christmas lights for 30 years. His home had won Best Decorated almost every season, becoming a local attraction. To him, the lights weren't just decoration, they were a legacy, a way of carrying on memories of his late wife who had adored the holiday spirit. For Gerald, Marjorie's rule wasn't about lights at all. It was about erasing joy. Parents began talking amongst themselves, venting frustration and quietly plotting. Some felt too intimidated to resist, fearing fines or harassment from the HOA board. But others weren't willing to surrender so easily. After all, Maplewood Heights wasn't just Marjorie's neighborhood, it was theirs too. The tension began to simmer. Houses remained dark, porches undecorated, and a strange gloom settled over the streets. What was once a place of joy felt cold and lifeless, as if the holiday had been stripped away before it even began. But then, something shifted. One night, just days after the ban, a single house lit up. A small strand of white lights framed a window on the corner lot. It wasn't much, but in the sea of darkness, it stood out like a beacon. The next evening, another house joined in, this time with a glowing wreath. Then another, with a lit snowflake in the yard. Slowly, quietly, resistance was building. Marjorie noticed immediately. Her car crept along the neighborhood streets like a predator searching for prey. She documented the violators, snapped photos of their decorations, and prepared a wave of warning letters. She believed she could crush the rebellion before it gained traction. But she underestimated the spirit of Maplewood Heights. The first wave of fines went out, each letter demanding immediate removal of decorations. Some homeowners caved, unwilling to pay the steep penalties. But others refused, leaving their lights shining defiantly. And those who resisted became heroes in the eyes of the neighborhood. Children whispered their names like legends, pointing excitedly to the glowing houses that dared to stand against the ban. It wasn't long before the conflict escalated. Neighbors began meeting in secret, gathering in garages and basements to discuss their options. Ideas ranged from petitioning to recall Marjorie, to staging a massive lighting protest. But one plan stood out among the rest, one that was bold, risky, and guaranteed to send a message she would never forget. Christmas wasn't going to be stolen so easily. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and soon, Maplewood Heights would light up brighter than it ever had before. And as the first chapter of this battle came to a close, one thing was clear: the war for Christmas lights had just begun. The tension in Maplewood Heights had grown thicker with every passing night. Where once the streets glowed with festive warmth, now they stood in eerie silence, dim and stripped of their holiday charm. The HOA ban loomed over every house like a dark shadow. Parents avoided conversations with their children about decorations, unwilling to disappoint them further, and families tiptoed around the subject of Christmas joy. But despite the suffocating gloom, a quiet rebellion had begun. Those first few brave homeowners who refused to bow to the HOA's threats had ignited something larger than themselves. Their lights, though small at first, carried a powerful message: joy could not be dictated, and tradition would not be erased by one person's obsession with control. As more houses flickered back to life with strings of lights and glowing ornaments, the neighborhood transformed into a silent battlefield. Each strand of tinsel, each bulb, each illuminated reindeer on the lawn became a symbol of defiance. The homeowners knew they were risking fines, harassment, and constant surveillance from Marjorie, but something in them had shifted. Fear had turned into resolve. Marjorie, of course, was furious. She doubled her efforts, driving through the streets at odd hours, jotting down notes on clipboards, and taking photos of every violation she could find. Letters of warning escalated into hefty fines. Threats of liens on homes began circulating. She was determined to break their spirit. To her, it wasn't just about the lights anymore, it was about power, about proving that her word was law and that resistance was futile. But what Marjorie didn't realize was that the more pressure she applied, the more unified the neighbors became. For years, Maplewood Heights had been just another suburb, filled with people who waved politely but rarely went beyond surface-level interactions. Now, under the weight of her iron fist, they were discovering something they hadn't experienced before: solidarity. Secret meetings grew larger. In garages warmed by space heaters and living rooms crowded with folding chairs, residents gathered to share ideas. Parents passed around cookies while children whispered excitedly in the background. Elderly neighbors who had rarely stepped outside their homes now joined in, lending their wisdom and experience to the cause. People who had barely spoken to each other for years now strategized side by side. The plan that emerged wasn't just about resistance, it was about reclaiming Christmas in a way Marjorie could never stop. The idea was simple yet powerful. Instead of individuals putting up random displays, the entire neighborhood would coordinate a massive, unified lighting spectacle. Each house would contribute a piece, and together, the street would transform into a breathtaking canvas of light and color. If one house lit up, Marjorie could target it, but if every house joined in, she would be powerless. She could find a handful of residents, but not the entire community. The scale would overwhelm her, and the message would be undeniable: Christmas belonged to the people, not to her. As the plan spread, excitement buzzed through the neighborhood. Old decorations were pulled from attics, dusted off, and tested. Some families pooled money to buy new strands of lights, while others crafted homemade displays. Children painted signs that read, "Christmas lives here," ready to hang them proudly in windows. Even Gerald, the widower who had cherished the tradition for decades, unveiled his late wife's treasured light collection, vowing to make this year brighter than ever. In the meantime, Marjorie sensed something was brewing. She noticed more activity in garages, more neighbors huddling in driveways, and more deliveries of decorations arriving at doorsteps. She could feel the rebellion building, though she didn't yet understand its full scale. Paranoia began to consume her. She monitored emails, demanded that the HOA board enforce stricter surveillance, and even patrolled the neighborhood herself late at night. She was determined to crush whatever was forming in the shadows. But her paranoia only deepened the resentment. Where once people had been annoyed with her, now they despised her. Parents whispered about how she was trying to steal joy from children. Teenagers mocked her behind her back, calling her the Grinch of Maplewood Heights. Even residents who had once been neutral now quietly leaned toward the rebellion, unwilling to let one woman dictate the tone of their holiday season. As the second week of December approached, the anticipation reached a boiling point. Behind closed doors, residents were finalizing their plan, synchronizing timers, and making sure every bulb was in place. The air was electric with excitement and defiance. And then, on one cold December evening, as the neighborhood sat cloaked in darkness and Marjorie prepared to make yet another patrol, the switch was flipped. One by one, house after house erupted into dazzling light. Strings of red, green, and gold burst to life across rooftops. Trees sparkled, inflatable Santas waved in the crisp night air. Lawns glowed with reindeer, candy canes, and glowing snowflakes. And at the very center of it all, Gerald's house stood tall, illuminated in a spectacular tribute to his late wife, thousands of bulbs creating a breathtaking display that outshone anything the neighborhood had ever seen before. The collective display was overwhelming. The street wasn't just decorated, it was alive, pulsing with unity and defiance. Families stood outside their homes, cheering, laughing, and embracing as children's faces lit up with pure joy. For the first time in weeks, Maplewood Heights felt like itself again. Marjorie, of course, was livid. She stormed down the street, her clipboard clutched in her hands, snapping photos and shouting threats that were drowned out by laughter and holiday music. She scribbled frantically, but it was clear she was outnumbered, outmatched, and utterly powerless against the tidal wave of resistance. And yet, she wasn't finished. Behind her rage was a cold determination. If the neighborhood thought they had won, they were mistaken. Marjorie wasn't about to let her authority crumble so easily. She retreated to her home that night with a new plan forming in her mind, one that would escalate the conflict to an entirely new level. The battle lines were drawn, the spirit of rebellion had ignited, and Maplewood Heights was heading toward a showdown unlike anything it had ever seen. The stage was set. The question now was not whether the lights would shine, but how far Marjorie would go to shut them down. The morning sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across driveways and lawns still damp with dew. I had barely poured my first cup of coffee when I heard the low, steady growl of an approaching diesel engine. My mind immediately went to the call I'd made the night before. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Peeking through the blinds, I saw the white city parking enforcement truck crawl down the street. It stopped directly in front of Karen's house, the officer inside scanning the curb, clipboard in hand. My pulse quickened as I realized just how perfectly the situation had aligned. Karen's car was still exactly where it had been the night before, half on the sidewalk, half in the street, a position that violated two separate parking ordinances. From my vantage point, I watched the officer step out, walk a slow circle around her car, and begin writing. The bright orange slip was placed neatly under her windshield wiper. A few minutes later, a tow truck arrived, this one an official city contractor, not the private kind Karen had called on me. Its hydraulic arm lowered with deliberate precision, the chains clinking as they wrapped around her tires. The sound was unmistakable. Even from inside my house, I could hear the mechanical whine as her car was lifted from the ground. The first tug tilted it at an awkward angle, the kind of sight that instantly sparks panic in any driver. I didn't have to wonder how she'd react, because seconds later, her front door burst open. Karen emerged in a flurry of motion, hair unkempt, still in her robe, waving her arms wildly at the tow truck driver. Even without hearing her words, her body language said everything: disbelief, outrage, the stubborn insistence that she was above the rules. She pointed toward my house once, maybe twice, as though trying to shift the blame, but the officer didn't so much as glance in my direction. This wasn't my doing, at least not on paper. This was a straightforward enforcement of city law. The tow truck driver didn't pause. The rear tires lifted completely off the ground, the truck eased forward, and just like that, Karen's spotless silver SUV was rolling away from her driveway. She stood there in the middle of the street, shouting at a vehicle that was already turning the corner and disappearing from sight. I sat back in my chair, the steam from my coffee curling upward like a victory flag. It wasn't the kind of revenge that required confrontation or messy arguments. It was clean, legal, and most importantly, undeniable. She had played herself. The rest of the morning was unusually quiet. Karen vanished into her house, curtains drawn, and didn't reappear for hours. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, though, and by midday, whispers had begun. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down as they passed her place, exchanging knowing glances. A couple of them even looked toward my driveway with a small, almost imperceptible nod. They had seen the way she targeted me. They knew she wasn't an innocent victim of bad luck. Still, I didn't gloat. Not openly, anyway. Revenge like this was most effective when it spoke for itself. My role was to act as though I had nothing to do with it, to let the city's own procedures stand as the sole cause. If Karen believed it was coincidence, maybe she'd think twice before coming after me again. But I underestimated her. The very next day, she reappeared, not with the subdued demeanor of someone who had just paid several $100s in towing and storage fees, but with an even sharper edge. Her posture was rigid, her eyes fixed on my house with renewed intensity. She might have been humiliated, but humiliation can harden into something dangerous when someone's ego is bruised badly. Enough. I soon noticed her pacing the sidewalk in front of her property, phone in hand, taking pictures not only of my car but of my yard, my mailbox, even the side of my house. She was looking for something, anything, that could be turned into ammunition. And she wasn't being subtle about it. That evening, I found yet another letter in my mailbox. This one was longer than the others, filled with citations of HOA bylaws, most of which had nothing to do with parking. She was expanding her scope now, trying to find new angles of attack. If the driveway battle was lost, she'd open a new front somewhere else. The part that unsettled me wasn't the letter itself, it was the realization that she wasn't just going to walk away. For her, this had become personal. And in neighborhoods like ours, personal grudges have a way of spiraling into all-out war. I knew then that the game wasn't over. Yes, her car had been towed, and yes, it had been deeply satisfying to watch. But Karen was regrouping. The look in her eyes when she passed my driveway told me she was already planning her next move. And if I wanted to protect my home, my peace, and my sanity, I would need to be ready for whatever came next.